Joe Seddon, welcome to the Development by David podcast. How are you?
I'm good, mate. How are you?
I'm good. It's so funny when I always start a conversation by saying, "How are you?" Because the listeners know we've had a preamble chat for like 15, 20 minutes before we've hit record. It's just natural for me to ask you how you are.
I don't know what you're talking about. I've never met you before. I've got no idea who you are, mate.
I was saying this before we hit record. Like, I've joined many calls with you in the past through some of the partnerships with our work, and I've left every single one of those calls saying to other colleagues, "Oh my god, I need Joe on the podcast." And every time they've agreed, and I finally reached out to you, and you were like more than happy to come on. So, mate, thank you so much for jumping on the podcast today.
I'm not sure what magical spell I've put on you over these Zoom calls. It's probably because I've got that auto-enhance feature on that all of these video recording softwares have on, where it sort of glows you up behind the camera. So if it's an early morning call, you haven't quite had time to have a shower, get your hair sorted out, it makes you look around 25% better. So I'll say that's what it is.
And sometimes it's like the dog ear filters you put on. So you really impressed me with the amount of filters you have, mate.
It must be that one. I took inspiration from that poor American lawyer who had that cat filter stuck on for around an hour, which disrupted that case.
I just seen that today. I could not stop laughing. I thought that was a prank. I didn't realize that was real.
Yeah, of course it's real. Look, there's loads of people who, even with the pandemic, that they still haven't quite adjusted to the new norm of video calls. Like I still have issues all the time with people. No, to use the pandemic phrase, no, you're on mute. It's still an issue.
There must be someone with that tattooed on them somewhere.
Probably, but I don't want to know who that person is.
Joe Seddon, before we go off on a tangent about your on mute tattoos, I need to do the preliminary traditional intro. Who is Joe Seddon today in 2022? The last podcast of the year, by the way.
Yeah, no, it's great to be on the last podcast of the year. Who's Joe Seddon in 2022? I don't know. Entrepreneur, founder, Yorkshireman. Hopefully not in that order. I'd probably put Yorkshireman first, being a proud Yorkshire boy. But yeah, I think we met around a year ago, didn't we? In terms of, I was running Zero Gravity, partnering with KPMG, and we were talking about what more could we do to really propel the best talent from around the country, from social mobile backgrounds into the best careers. And I think it was just a natural connection from there, right? As two young people who'd sort of been on very different journeys, but with that sort of uniting theme of having to sort of defy the odds to get where we got to. So I think that was the initial link between us, right?
100%, mate. And talking about that theme, let's go back to your origin story, your genesis story, and unpick the journey that you've been on from Morley to £1 million investments. Where did it all begin?
So you write the title of the episode already there. Morley to £1 million investment. I might use that one. So I grew up in Morley, which is a small town in the UK between Leeds and Wakefield. It's one of those towns that political analysts would say is part of the Red Wall or a post-industrial town. But for me, it was home, and I grew up in a single parent family. I was raised by my mum, who's a speech therapist in the NHS, and got two younger siblings. And I sort of lived an ordinary existence of a sort of young British boy. I was obsessed with football. That's what I wanted my career to be. And probably by the age of 12, 13, found out that I wasn't going to quite make it. Or when I say quite make it, didn't get anywhere close. But that was my sort of first passion and love in life. And my sort of second passion was technology. And like many people our age, I grew up in an era where these fantastic digital technologies were disrupting our lives in both positive and negative ways, whether it was Facebook becoming the predominant social network, or the iPhone coming out when we were sort of 12 years old, or all these incredible apps, Snapchat, Twitter, and then sort of moving into university and seeing things like Deliveroo and Uber. And I was obsessed with all these great technologies, and I was one of those weirdos who after school every day used to get home and listen to these podcasts about what was going on in Silicon Valley. And I kind of hoped that one day that I could be someone who is involved in this technical revolution as well. And yeah, I made my way from state schools in West Yorkshire to Oxford University, which was a huge leap. And no one in my a family had been to Oxbridge before, and the application process was incredibly mysterious. I didn't quite know what I was doing at any point, but managed to get an offer and studied PP at university, and went from there really in terms of founding Zero Gravity.
Given that you didn't have anyone in your immediate or wider circle that had ever been to Oxbridge, did you ever feel like a boy like you didn't belong in a place like that, or shouldn't apply for a place like that? What gave you the inner belief to take that leap? Did you have any support from charities or like kind of career kind of counselors at school, career advisors or counselors at school? Like what instilled that belief in you at that age?
I think I was someone who's always ambitious and determined from a young age. I wanted to be someone who kind of defied the norm of where I was from. But at the same time, Oxbridge wasn't really on the radar for me until I got my GCSE results when I was 16. And it was only at that point I thought, maybe I do have what it takes to go to somewhere like that. But the issue was that I didn't have anyone in my kind of network who'd been before, whether it was a family member. Very few people from my school had attended. So I was very much starting from scratch in terms of having the inside track of what you need to get into an institution like that. Now, the internet is incredible in terms of leveling the playing field for information. You can Google search how to get into Oxford University or what is an Oxford interview like. But the internet doesn't replace being able to sit down with someone who's been through it themselves. It can level the playing field in information, but it can't level the playing field in terms of giving you the inside track. And that's what I really missed. And yeah, I found the interview process really, really tough. It was a completely alien environment. I very much felt out my depth at every point, like even on some of the basics in terms of like, what do you wear? How do you comport yourself? Do you hide your accent? Those were all issues that I was grappling with, even before getting to the sort of academic content that you need. And my first interview went so badly that I thought I completely fucked up my entire chance of going. And it was only that made me actually relax. The sort of thought that actually I've already messed it up. I've got nothing to lose at this point. So I count my lucky stars that my first interview went that badly that I was able to relax, because otherwise I definitely wouldn't have got in.
And making the geographical relocation to Oxford, how did your environment in Morley differ from that of Oxford?
Yeah, it's completely different. I think one of the things which isn't really spoken about very much in terms of people's social mobility journeys is that everyone always talks about the imposter syndrome of stepping into a new environment that you're not quite part of and having to deal with their different traditions and not quite feeling part of it. But that the other part is also leaving where you're from. And I remember leaving West Yorkshire and people in a way thought I was kind of selling myself out. Like there really is a sort of cultural north-south divide in terms of when I told people I was going to Oxford for university, people thought it was incredible. They sort of couldn't understand how the application process worked and thought it was a great opportunity. But at the same time, there was a sense in which I was sort of selling my soul, that I was sort of going to live with all the poshos now, and I was going to leave behind my northern roots. And in some ways that's true. Like in terms of my life now, I've lost my accent a little bit. Like if you sort of spoke to me, you wouldn't necessarily think I was from the north of England straight away, and sort of changed the way I act, I suppose, over time in a way. So it's not like that's not a fair analysis, but at the same time it was a tough thing to take, because not only do you not necessarily feel at home in the environment you're stepping into, but you also leave a part of yourself behind at the same time.
I relate to that a lot. I feel social mobility guilt at times for working at a corporation and often taking trips to London and often exposing to new tastes and traits that those from my background typically didn't adopt. Have you noticed that your tastes and traits have changed because of your experience at Oxford? And do you think they were genuine? Do you think there was a genuine transformation in tastes and traits, or do you think it was more like survival of the fittest, like trying to mask or kind of mirror their traits just to fit in?
I think I've like inevitably like some of the ways I behave and some of my interests have changed just because of the nature of the people who I spend my time with. But at the same time, I've always tried to keep myself rooted where I'm from. But I'm almost having to like over adjust and overcompensate for that. Like it's when we did our intro, for instance, and I mentioned straight away I was from Yorkshire. That's probably a natural narrative that's seared into me that I need to reinforce with everyone where I'm from because I don't want to lose that as part of my identity. So I always bring it up straight away, subconsciously, and I think it's tough because I'm really proud of where I'm from, but at the same time, I don't want to sugarcoat that. It was really difficult in many ways growing up in Morley in terms of the lack of opportunity. A lot of the time, and as you sort of asked earlier, like there was no real support from any corporates, universities, social mobility charities, because in a lot of small towns in the UK, you just get forgotten about. And if you grow up in a great city like London or Manchester or Birmingham, often there's support on tap, whether it's from your school or employers or universities. But if you're in a small town, often there's nothing in person whatsoever. And that is what really planted the seed for zero gravity for me in terms of I wanted to use technology to change that in terms of if you were growing up in a small town in the UK, you weren't locked away from opportunity by the geography in which you lived in.
Oh, I love it, Joe. And when I've been asked to define social mobility, my definition would be the amount of ease or friction between an individual and their access and awareness to opportunity. But for me, the awareness is such a catalyst for the access. Like we hear about equality of opportunity is a kind of buzzword phrase that's thrown around all the time. But there needs to be access. There needs to be awareness of that. When you were in Yorkshire, did you have any role models that were kind of reaching for the stars that perhaps subconsciously or vicariously kind of rubbed off in your motivation? Like for me, having role models or having mentors and having people that came from a background like mine and grew that into something became such a huge inspiration for my own motivation and my own trajectory. Did you have any of that around you?
Yeah, I think for like many people who grew up with a sort of strong family unit, it was my grandma. In terms of from a young age, she took a interest in me. Would give me interesting things to read. Would talk to me about current affairs. Would always sort of push me to take on new opportunities. And it was only by having that someone like that in my sort of family unit that I was able to sort of lift my head up and look at what was out there above and beyond what was in my immediate environment. So I was incredibly lucky in that regard, and I think it is a big issue because I use the word luck there, and it is luck. But if you live in a great city like London where you're surrounded by opportunity every single day, it's no surprise that that makes you more audacious or bolder and gives you ideas and inspirations because it's constantly on tap. Like if you grow up in a low income family in Tower Hamlets, you can be living in a really difficult situation in terms of like maybe you're living in relative poverty, there's no gang crime nearby. But if you're getting the tube every day past Canary Wharf, and when you're walking to school, you're meeting people whose parents are working in lots of different types of job roles, and you sort of constantly hear these inspirational stories of people who've defied the odds, whether it's starting their own company or moving to a different country, then that rubs off in your mentality over time. And one of the big difficulties, I think, outside the urban hubs is that kind of culture just isn't there because of the nature of places being geographically locked off from the rest of the country with poor infrastructure, and the way that sort of reinforces the way that cultures work. So I was lucky that I had somebody in my family unit who was an inspiration to me, but it was luck at the end of the day. And I think one of the things that we all need to work on is how do we take luck out of the equation and make sure that ambitious, talented people can get where they want to get.
And the early inspiration provided by your grandma, do you think that was amplified once you were dragged and dropped into Oxford, where probably everyone around you mustered great inspiration and were at a high performing caliber? Do you think that turned that up to some degree?
Absolutely. This is the secret source of Oxbridge, which they don't really talk about publicly, which is like, of course, Oxford and Cambridge are incredible academic institutions where you get loads of support. There's fantastic lecturers, fantastic facilities. Like, that's all true. But the real magic source of Oxbridge is the way it shapes your mentality, in terms of you turn up on day one and you're told straight away that you are the, to use the awful phrase, the brightest and the best, and that the people in this room are going to go on to lead companies, sit in the cabinet, make disruptive academic leap forwards, and that is constantly also reinforced by the people around you who believe that about themselves, believe that about their friends, that everybody's working really hard, and that just sort of changes your mentality over time, in terms of things that growing up in Morley would have seemed completely out of reach or ridiculous ideas, just kind of became the norm. And that is the sort of secret sauce of Oxbridge, how it creates that audacious mindset amongst the people who are part of the institution. It's that sort of cultural component which you can't, it's difficult to describe. You can't quite put your finger on it, but you can kind of tell when someone's been to Oxbridge in terms of the way they comport themselves and talk and act, and that is the massive value out of those universities.
And I find it strange or bewildering that some words have different semantics within the environments that they're used. So one of the words that you used there was disruptive. Disruptive within Oxbridge had positive connotations, but disruptive back home in Yorkshire or Ayrshire, where I'm from, has very negative connotations. Like, I'm told not to be disruptive, not to ask for more, not to take more than what I'm given. And it's the same with risk. Risk, where I'm from and maybe where you're from, has so many negative connotations wrapped around it. Did you feel that some of these fetishized words meant different things within Oxbridge than they did at home, like risk, like disruption, etc.? And can you think of any other examples?
Yes, it kind of shows you how the concepts and the culture are informed by the type of people who tend to inhabit the university, right? Like, you refer to risk there. Like, I think one of the things that Oxford is very good at is increasing people's tolerance for risk, because you're constantly told to try new things, embrace failure. And that's all well and good if you're someone from an affluent background where failing at something means you can just restart and go again. But like David, if you're from a part of the country where you're disadvantaged, failure can be catastrophic, in terms of there can be no coming back from it sometimes. So I do think it's incredibly socially loaded, but at the same time, I do think there is a huge power to it as well. And now I feel that the kind of cultural lessons that I took from university have been useful in my own life. Like, I did need to increase my risk tolerance as I've grown older, and I don't think I would have started a company out of university if I didn't have a high risk tolerance. But at the same time, like you said, it's easy to have a high risk tolerance if you're from an affluent background.
I love that. I love the kind of point you made around failure, because if you come from a lower socioeconomic background, you don't have the material. You don't have, yeah, you don't have the material the capital or the material to offset some of the failures that you might face. Like your organization, your business not taking off could mean that you don't eat or you can't pay rent. I've been reading into the concept of luxury beliefs, and it's basically like beliefs that are held by different people within different social classes. And one being, I've been looking at the kind of reading about some essays around like the diversity for net zero or the net zero transition, and it's important to know that, like, for example, some people from lower socioeconomic background might not be able to afford solar panels or EVs, but those from a kind of more affluent background might be able to make those changes. But culturally, that could create a divide, because there's expectations of those from a more affluent area that are kind of perpetuated and imposed on those from a lower socioeconomic background. And much like COVID with vaxxers and anti-vaxxers, it can create like a stark culture divide. And so the reason I'm asking that question was, were there any opinions or beliefs that you had that were polarizing to those of your peers at Oxford? And did you ever notice a stark divide between you and some of your classmates culturally because of that?
Yeah, I think there was a big cultural divide around questions of sort of belonging and identity. As someone who sort of grew up in a a small northern. I sort of put a big amount of value in sort of community institutions, whether those be football club or like your local pub or like the school that you went to. And but Oxford was very sort of metropolitan, cosmopolitan environment, liberal with a small L, and the ideas of identity and belonging were often seen as kind of almost like semi-dangerous concepts associated with nationalism or bigotry. And I used to sort of speak to people at university, and I was like, describing some of the views of people in the area where I grew up, and it's like you can't automatically assume that people who have a different view to you are bigoted. Like you have to understand that globalization, for instance, is disruptive, and you may see that as a good thing, and maybe overall it is a good thing. But in terms of the disruption that can cause in certain communities, it's no wonder that someone in Morley sees that as a threat or a danger when it's led to so much economic dislocation. A city that was once a fantastic in part of the UK industrial powerhouse turned into a completely different place. So those are just sort of some of the small examples. But one of the things I saw at university which I didn't like was that there was sometimes an intolerance towards the views or people from different parts of the UK that weren't quite as cosmopolitan as London and university cities, and that's something I think that needs to change, because any sort of polarization around those cultural questions is not good for anyone at the end of the day.
Definitely not. So you're still at Oxford. You're still studying when you developed the premise for zero gravity, because it wasn't initially called zero gravity. You developed another platform that essentially merged into zero gravity. Am I right?
Yeah, so I had the idea at university. I like when I got to the end of my degree, I had some offers for various corporate jobs, working at a hedge fund, corporate law firm. But I was like, I don't want to do this. I want to try and build my own tech startup. And I just reflected on the problems I'd faced in life, and I thought, this is a good place to start and to try and build something for my younger self, almost. So I had the idea at university, but when I graduated, I actually moved back to West Yorkshire to launch, because I had no money. I had 200 quid left over from my student loan. So I had to move back in with my mum, sister, and brother to get going. Whilst all my friends moved to London, which was difficult in and of itself, because all my friends were moving into the sort of nice corporate lifestyle, and they're having their own flats, and they're going to cool places in London, and I was sort of back home where I started. So that was a difficult adjustment. But I believed so passionately in what I was doing, and like you said, David, that initially I kept the scope quite small, in terms of I had this grand vision of I was going to use technology to change the way that talent was identified and then propelled into these top institutions. But I knew I couldn't do that with 200 quid. So at the beginning, I launched a platform which solely concentrated on getting people into Oxford and Cambridge University from low income backgrounds, because that was the ecosystem which I knew best. It was a big problem for those universities. And then tactically, I also knew there was a huge amount of media pressure on the universities and interest in their admissions. And I thought, if I can really prove that what I'm doing works, it's going to be a great way to sort of get traction that would be difficult to get if I started focusing on a different set of institutions. So there was a kind of a tactical component to it as well. But yeah, that's how I got started.
What were some of the results that you saw in your proof of concept? Just for what kind of results did you see within that small selective pool that you first started with? Did it prove to be a success?
Yeah, well, thankfully it did. But there was sort of two things that I did at the beginning, which really helped build the organization. The first thing is I thought deeply about how do we identify the talent in the UK state sector that we want to support. I saw that all of these organizations were grappling with different metrics, terminology for defining low-income, socially mobile people. And whilst that was useful, I thought none of these people are actually putting themselves in the shoes of the end user, which is a sort of 16, 17-year-old at school who doesn't regard themselves as a socially mobile person or a whining participation student. They just see themselves as a 16 or 17-year-old, and they want convenience. So these people are used to using apps like TikTok and Instagram. Like, they don't want to have to go through some huge due diligence process about their background. So I sort of designed an app where people could sort of sign up in 60 seconds, really. And from that sign up process, we would pull various bits of data that would algorithmically allow us to build a profile of someone's background and their performance. So, for instance, by putting in their home address, we could look at the socioeconomic status of people on that street, how many people go to university in that local address, crime rates. About when they put in their school, we could work out what's the Ofsted rating of that school, how much progress the students make there, and also compare their grades to the average person at their school. And by sort of designing that process that only took 60 seconds for a student to complete, but gave us those really powerful data profiles, we were able to identify lots of top talent. The people who, on paper, you might not necessarily think are the people who should be going to Oxford and Cambridge University. But actually, if you have a good picture of their background, these are the perfect people. People who don't have straight A's at school, but they've got a mixture of A, B's, and C's. But the average person at their school is failing, and they come from a town with limited opportunities. So I put a lot of effort into designing that system that actually found the talent in the first place. And then the second part was, once you've identified a talent, how do you actually get them in to these institutions? And I just focused on giving people the inside track, and what that meant was connecting them with a mentor who was one step ahead of them on the journey, and then building technology around that made it as easy as possible to connect with their mentor, and kind of structured their journey in a way in which they could take small steps every week towards their end goal. So it wasn't rocket science in a way in terms of the concepts. Like, the ultimate concept's quite simple: find the best talent and propel them into the institutions. But I put a lot of effort into designing a user experience that I thought young people wanted to use. And that was what made the platform so effective, because we had people doing thousands of hours of mentoring sessions on this platform. Like, the first cohort of students we had 150 ish students from low income backgrounds applying to Oxbridge, but all these people were doing 10, 15, 20 mentorship sessions over a 6-month period, and it was that engagement that was driving the impact in terms of our ability to actually get them in. And then the stories that came out of that was what really propelled the organisation forwards. Not just the headline numbers in terms of how many people from our cohort were getting offers, but the actual personal stories behind them, in terms of people who, again, you would think, looking at their background, this is not someone who should be going to Oxford and Cambridge. This is not the stereotype. But actually, it's somebody who's clearly incredibly talented, and they just needed a kind of push in the right direction to get in there, and that's what the platform offered them.
Joe, I'm playing Post-it Note Rain. I don't know what I want to use as my next question, because so many come to mind. I love how user experience was one of the most prominent guiding principles that you wanted to follow. How did you ultimately engage young people to get onto the app in the first place? Because when I look at a lot of these social mobility charities and their offerings, they're kind of pointed at aspiring adolescents or aspiring teenagers or aspiring students, but a lot of people don't quite yet know they can be aspiring, because they don't have that visibility of careers around them. They don't have any success stories from their local area. They just don't quite believe they can be that. How did you nudge people onto the platform in the first place? I'm really curious to know about that.
Yeah, well, the first thing I thought about was brand. Like you, I'd seen the universities, employers, various charities, try and appeal to young people and fail dramatically. And I kind of reflected on why that was. And the ultimate reason, in my mind, was you had all of these institutions with their institutional brands trying to speak to 16, 17-year-olds who'd even never heard of them or thought they were out of reach. So, like, how do you expect someone to behave in that scenario, and that's why I wanted to build a brand for Zero Gravity that was not institutional. It didn't sound academic. It didn't sound like it was an adult speaking down to you, but it felt like a young person. It had a really clear, youthful attitude, and an attitude of ambition, defiance, being bold. So I deliberately designed to appeal to young people and not really feel like a social mobility brand, just feel more like the kind of tech product that young people would want to use every day. So yeah, put a lot of effort into design. That was a big decision because when I sort of raised my first sort of round of investment to really build the organization, one of the first things that I actually spent money on was working with a really top small brand agency to build the brand. And I remember at the time I had questions of, why do you want to spend £15,000 on creating a logo and color scheme? And I was like, look, it's not about creating a logo or color scheme. It's about defining who we are and how we want people to feel about us. And that was incredibly important to me in terms of building a brand that young people could relate to. I mean, in terms of actually like finding them, social media was the first go-to. Like I knew that we wouldn't be able to work with schools at the beginning because we didn't have credibility yet. We were the new kid on the block, but I knew social media was a great way to move past the gatekeepers and get straight into the phones of young people. So we just used Instagram, Facebook, TikTok didn't exist back when I started, but we just used social media to identify students, and that was really great because it allowed us to sort of build our first cohorts, but also allowed us to access a different type of person, which is not the sort of super academic student who has their mind fixed on a particular institution and knows they want to get there. We were able to reach that person who is ambitious, they're talented, but they don't quite know if they've got it in them to do it, and they're not thinking about applying to a particular institution. So it allowed us to identify a different type of person, and I was passionate about doing that because, to link it back to our previous discussion, I know a lot of young people living in small towns across the UK kind of fit into that demographic. Like very few people in Morley grow up thinking I want to go to Oxbridge, and very few people in Morley grow up thinking that I'm super academic and I'm the bee's knees and I'm going to be able to do it. Like people need that kind of vote of confidence in themselves, and they need to have their ambition and curiosity sparked. And that's why I think social media can be so powerful in terms of getting through to different type of person.
Joe, do you remember the first point that you reflected on the journey so far and said to yourself, this is why I do what I do? Was there a significant pivot or life-changing experience for one of the mentees, or a specific milestone that you crossed where you were kind of reaffirmed that you chose the right journey after Oxford?
Like I've always been a bit of a data guy in all honesty. So the thing that really mattered to me was actually showing that the platform worked. We did some really boring but useful randomized control trials with UCAS, where they essentially looked at zero gravity students on the platform and found those statistically comparable university applicants on paper, and like looked at the different outcomes, and that proved that our platform actually really did work, even when you compared like for like, and was having a dramatic impact. And that was really important to me because I always wanted to have that kind of scientific rigor about what we were doing. I've been just seeing the scale up of the numbers as well, and they're going from supporting 150 people when I was doing this out of my bedroom to now supporting 5,000 students every year into university. Like that is really powerful for me, because even though it sounds a bit dry and it's just data, like that shows that actually there's 5,000 people behind that number. And if you can continue to scale and create something huge nationwide, like that's going to have a dramatic impact on actually the people who go into these institutions, whether it's Oxbridge, other universities, apprenticeships, corporate careers. If you can do something at scale, you can change things far quicker than you imagine in terms of the culture of these institutions. So that was really motivating for me. And of course, some of the stories coming out of the platform were unreal. Like very quickly, I was meeting these students and I was thinking like, gosh, these people are so much brighter and more interesting than I was at their age. And we had a number of them who were sort of profiled by different media organizations. And I thought that was great because not only did that put the Zero Gravity brand up in lights, but it enabled that young person to also turn into an advocate and ambassador themselves for their particular identity, whether it was their hometown or their ethnicity or something else about them. Like we had a student called Millie Ayres 2 years ago who was from a traveling showman community. So it's a community that I think is often overlooked in discussions of social mobility. Travelers have some of the worst education outcomes of any ethnic group, and she was someone who dropped out of school, did her GCSEs at home, didn't get incredible, the best grades in the world in terms of straight A stars, but was someone who was a clear overperformer. And she used our platform to learn Latin and get into Oxford, study classics. And that was one of those stories which was like, wow, it's a sort of pinch yourself story in terms of so many angles of it that are just crazy in terms of defying the odds. But Millie's now become an incredible advocate for traveling showmen around the country, and shows to young women in that community like what's possible, defying the stereotype and introducing people outside that community to the community as well. And it's, if we can do that for thousands of people, I think that's going to be massive in terms of the culture change as well that we spoke about. And when you can see people like you succeeding and still speaking in the same kind of voice, whether it's the accent or the tone or whatever it is, like that's far more inspirational than seeing a sort of 50-year-old CEO on the screen.
And I think by doing that, we'll move away from the accent biases that we have. I've heard stories where at other firms where partners didn't put colleagues in front of senior clients because their accent was too risky, because they were from like Liverpool or something like that. And I think the more representative examples that we have of talent from different parts of the UK with different accents, there will be less of an accent bias within the workplace and the wider community.
Yeah, and that's ridiculous, right? Because there's actually quite a few studies out there that show that people with strong accents are regarded as more trustworthy. Subconsciously, the people assume that if you've got an accent rather than speaking in pure Shakespearean English, that you're more trustworthy. I think because, going back to our discussion earlier, accents are kind of associated with belonging and identity, and that has a sort of trust component to it, rather than being somebody who is almost belongingless or accentless and could sort of shapeshift into anything. So the strong accents are good in terms of putting those people in front of clients. But I think I've always believed is that with these discussions over accent and other things, it's really difficult to change people's biases. And of course, there's work that can be done, but the easiest way to stop accent being an issue in the workplace is just to get more people with accents into the workplace. You can put people through as much implicit bias training as you want, but things are never going to change unless you can get the kind of critical mass of people into the workforce from those backgrounds. So that's what I've really kept Zero Gravity resolutely focused on. They're creating a platform that actually works and gets people into these institutions, because once you do that, the cultures change dramatically. Like I've seen it myself in terms of at Oxford. Like when I was a student there, it was roughly 50-50 in terms of state and private schools, and nowadays it's more like 70-30. And like 1 in 4 of all of the diverse students starting at Oxford now are coming through the Zero Gravity platform. So we've helped sort of drive that change. And I've been back to the university recently, and the culture has changed like really clearly in terms of just the kind of the feel of the place. Like it feels far more diverse than it did back when I was a student. And that is just a result of the fact there's more students there from backgrounds like mine than there was when I was a student. So you got to stay focused on the talent and getting people in. They're trying to kind of treat the symptom rather than the cause is not going to get you anywhere.
In addition to accent, are there any other invisible barriers to social mobility that you see from your point of view?
I think there's loads of barriers. The reason I called zero gravity was because my understanding of, of the barriers is that academics like to sort of split them up into separate chunks, whether it be economic barriers and then network barriers, information barriers. But ultimately, all of these things are interrelated. Like if you don't have access to a great network and you're not going to a top performing school and you don't have very much money, that is going to affect your confidence and your motivation over time. So it's not right to think of these things as separate causes. Everything is connected in a cycle, and in many ways it can feel quite intangible. Like the metaphor I heard people use was that it felt like they almost had like a gravity pinning them down, and some of those things were very substantial things like not having money, but some of it was just felt like an invisible force. Like no matter what they did, it was never going to be enough. And that's why I called zero gravity, because it was all about taking that force away and allowing someone to buy into that new mentality, which is actually that there's nothing here that's gonna stop me. Like the sort of master of my own fate, and that's a cyclical process. That's about improving people's network, improving their finances, improving their information, access to mentors, and the ripple effect that has on confidence. But you can't split these things into different causes. It's all interrelated.
There's the cliched statement of your network is your net worth. Do you totally agree with that? And if so, why?
100%. I think this is one of the really key parts of social mobility which hasn't been spoken about enough. And I think the reason why it hasn't been spoken about is like a lot of people speak about social mobility through the lens of education, and everyone likes to think that education is incredibly meritocratic, and everyone knows there's a huge amount of noise around grades in school and how do we make sure that state schools perform as well as private schools in different parts of the country. But networks drive everything when it comes to careers, like whether it's having access to someone who you can have a 30-minute chat with, who will tell you something that completely changes your perspective on an issue or changes your trajectory in terms of the things that you go out and look at, whether it's just having people there to provoke your curiosity and inspiration. But I've seen, as someone moving down to London, that network is everything. And when I was growing Zero Gravity, I saw this time and time again. When it came to raising investment to grow the organization, that all came out of me building a network. And without that network, I wasn't able to do it. But once I had that network, I could. And when it came to sort of actually running a business, like being able to speak to people who'd done that before and grown something from sort of zero to 100, again, that came out of having a great network on tap, and that's not something I had when I was sort of 16 or 18, and I just built it up over time. But I think the thing about a network is you only know it's valuable once you've got it, and that is why I think a lot of socially mobile people struggle to build a network, because they don't have one in the first place, and therefore they don't realize how valuable it is. And in many ways, networking becomes a bit of a dirty term. Like I know if I sort of use the word network with my friends who I grew up with, people would have sort of associated with horrific sort of corporate networking events where you're sort of going over to people holding a glass of prosecco and having an awkward 5-minute conversation. It's kind of seen as a dirty term, but that's actually not what networking's about at the end of the day.
It's not. I read a statistic a couple months ago, and it was around different degree classifications from Oxbridge, or maybe it was Cambridge, and the and socioeconomic background, and the likelihood that they would get a graduate job. I think it was like an individual from a lower socioeconomic background with a first class degree from Oxbridge is less likely to get into a graduate job than the equivalent student with a second class honours from the same university but from a more affluent background. Why would that occur? Is that related to network, do you believe?
Yeah, it's 100% related to network. There's been a big change in graduate employment in the past 20 years where it's become more professionalized in a way. Back in the 1980s was this big bang in the city of London where all of these finance jobs were sort of opened up to the masses, and there was sort of the whole sort of derogatory notion of the sort of Essex man that came out of that. But it sort of related to the idea that those industries were growing very quickly, and the people who were ambitious and bold were able to go into those jobs and work in jobs whose stereotypically the people from those backgrounds never worked in before. But in the sort of 1990s and 2000s, the sort of HR processes around getting graduate jobs, especially in London, became far more formalized. And on paper, you might think that would make the process more meritocratic. But actually, whenever you create a process which is complex, that is when the inequalities seep in, because people who can navigate complexity with access to information, with access to network, get an inherent advantage. And if you think about what it takes to get a graduate job today, like usually you have to have relevant work experience. But how do you get relevant work experience? And you have to start somewhere, and usually it comes out of having a network, having that family member who can do that informal placement for you, or can help you through the application process to get an internship at their friend's company. So it all starts from there, really. And one of the big difficulties, I think, for students nowadays is getting access to work experience, because all of these job roles are so competitive. If you're applying to a major graduate employer, the chances of getting in are even lower than the chances of applying to the top universities in this country. And if you don't have work experience, you're stuffed most of the time. And access to work experience is deeply connected to having a network at the beginning.
And I'm so glad that you founded a platform that democratizes that and gives people like me, or ones like me and ones like you, access to mentors and access to counsel and access to support. I just wish Zero Gravity was a platform that existed when I was applying for university or first applying for my apprenticeship program. Have you seen great effects or great testimonials from mentors? Do they get quite a lot of it as well?
Yeah, this was one of the things that actually sort of took me by surprise almost, in terms of like when I was first growing the platform, I was incredibly grateful towards the mentors on the platform, because those are the people making all the magic happen, right? I mean, I'd sit down with the mentors and actually they would say to me, thank you so much for founding this platform. This is one of the favorite things that I do during the week. And it sort of made me realize that actually the mentoring isn't just a one-way process. It's not just about a mentor disseminating wisdom to a mentee. Like often it also operates the opposite way around as well. And like I've mentored myself in many ways. Like now I sort of mentor a number of young entrepreneurs, and I've spoken to lots of mentors who use our platform. And really mentoring is one of the best things you can do for your own personal development and growth, because you have to take a position of responsibility. You have to think about someone else's future, and often that can help you also think about yourself, because it's difficult to sort of sit down and meditate on your own future, but it's very easy to do that to someone else, right? And in many ways that can be a good way to sort of find the principles that are also going to work in your own situation as well. And it's also just great in terms of building the sort of soft skills you need to get on, like communication, logical thinking, research. So I think being a mentor on a Zero Gravity platform is good for the personal development and career development of our mentors. And it's one of the parts of our proposition we're continuing to strengthen, in terms of giving mentors access to job opportunities, exclusive benefits, because ultimately, if we can create a system where everyone has skin in the game, in terms of it's not just about doing the best for yourself and your own career, but then also looking behind you and extending the ladder back, that is ultimately what is going to create the scalable solution here. So it's a huge part of what we do.
I love it, Joe. I love it. And recently you raised $5 million worth of investment, and some of those investors are celebrity names or prolific figures. Have you had the opportunity to meditate on that and reflect on what young teenage tech nerd Joe would have thought of hearing that news if you could go back and tell him?
Yeah, I think it would have been completely unfathomable. Those sort of quantums of of money, like still today seem like huge amounts. Like I remember when I moved to Oxford for university and got my first maintenance loan dropped into my bank account, which was like, maybe £2,000. Like that was the biggest amount of money I'd ever seen before at the time. And it felt like a huge responsibility to have that much money. I had to do everything in my power not to spend it all straight away on Freshers Week. So yeah, no, it would have been really difficult to picture back when I was 16. And I was lucky that the idea behind zero gravity was something that resonated with so many people, that I was able to build a network over time of these socially conscious investors who read about what I was doing in the press or came across a social media post and just wanted to help, and they wanted to help build something for their younger self. And that's ultimately how I was able to raise the funding to grow my idea, by sort of tapping into the network of sort of people who'd been on a similar journey. So this is a platform for socially mobile people. They're built by socially mobile people and also funded ultimately by them as well, which I think tells a nice story, because this is not about charity. And the Zero Gravity is a business, and ultimately we're growing something that is going to be scalable and sustainable in the future. But I think that just shows that talent is something that never goes out of fashion, and getting more people from low income backgrounds, social mobile backgrounds into top institutions is not just good for them, but it's good for the entire society, the institutions they go into, and the economy as well. And that's why I ultimately see this as a kind of business issue rather than something that's about philanthropy and charity. No, we're not dealing in charity cases here. We're dealing in people who are incredibly talented and need to have their potential unlocked. And I think one of the big issues in this sector is people have seen it too much through the lens of charity historically, in terms of it's about doing stuff that looks nice on paper and giving people a little bit of support, but it's much bigger than that. And yeah, that's what I'm trying to build with Zero Gravity.
And to be transparent and to have a kind of through the keyhole look into the improvement of your life, how has being a tech founder and tech entrepreneur and raising such investment and having such great results, both I guess financially and emotionally with the mentees, how has your life fundamentally changed on this journey? Do you live an exquisite, sexy lifestyle that you see many entrepreneurs living?
So like I think my 16-year-old self would probably think that I live a exquisite, sexy lifestyle now. I'm not sure about compared to some other entrepreneurs that you see online. Like often it is sort of very late nights in the office and missing drinks with friends because I'm buried in work. But my life has changed dramatically. Like being able to walk into the office in the morning and there's a team of 20 plus people who are sort of working on the idea that I was back in the day just doing by myself in the bedroom. Like that is just crazy in many ways, and you have to pinch yourself. And Zero Gravity has been a great vehicle of social mobility for myself as well, and I'm growing alongside the organization, and that is in a way is quite useful, because I am still, even though I'm getting older, like a user in a way, in terms of I'm encountering all of these problems in my life in terms of new things, stepping into new environments, and I'm thinking like, how can I solve this for myself 6 months ago, such that the people coming behind me on the journey don't have to deal with things in the way that I did. Like for instance, I had to rely on a lot of luck and graft to build that network in which I was then able to sort of tap into to raise funding to grow the company. Like, how do we make sure that in the future, if you're a founder from a low income background, you have investors and capital that comes to you, rather than having to go out there and build a network that you don't currently have. So yeah, my life has changed dramatically, and I feel very lucky in a way. But I'm hoping this is just the beginning, and I'm hoping that my story hopefully can inspire other people from small towns across the UK who want to become entrepreneurs, because I think too much entrepreneurial coverage is dominated by people who who seem to live in completely different realities to a lot of people in this country.
It's exactly why I asked that question, Joe. I also want to ask about comparison. The whole cliched statement, like comparison is a thief of joy. If your network has grown into something that's quite lucrative in terms of the net worth of maybe some of the people that are around you, and you're still scaling an organization, how do you remove yourself from comparing your net worth to your new kind of upper echelon of contacts? Do you ever compare yourself to the people that you now surround yourself with?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Like, we've got some investors in the organization. Some of them have become friends who are like billionaires, for instance, and that would have like knowing a billionaire back when I was even like 21 would have seemed completely crazy. I don't really sort of compare myself to those people because like they're much older than me, which helps a little bit, and B, I sort of see them as people who can mentor me and help me on my journey. So I don't struggle with comparison in that regard in terms of being surrounded by a network of incredibly wealthy individuals. I think the people I probably compare myself most to are people same age as me, in all honesty, and that is, and I think the interesting part there is kind of the flip side of entrepreneurship, where you're right, David. Like there's certain things that I get to do as part of my role and on my journey, which seem incredibly sexy and cool. But the reverse side of it as well is a huge amount of sacrifice, and I don't mean that in the kind of glamorous sort of Hollywood story style, but just the kind of the truth and reality, which is sometimes you got to work like late into the night, like you have to sacrifice time with your friends, building relationships, time with family, and I sometimes look at other people who've got that component in their life. I do feel a degree of sort of jealousy about it in terms of, I really wish I could spend more time at home with my family. I really wish I could sort of maybe take more satisfaction out of the small moments in life, like going for a walk at the weekend. But when you're sort of in growing a business, like you're constantly on the go, and you're constantly having your phone pinged with WhatsApps and emails, and there's always a problem to deal with. And now I feel incredibly lucky to be in that position where I'm growing something, but it is a huge sacrifice to make, and that is the comparison that I mainly make with people, in terms of there is definitely a spectrum of what you want in life, from being able to find satisfaction to being very kind of mission orientated and having a really clear purpose. And now I've chosen at this point I want to be someone who has a really clear purpose and sort of goes full pelt going for that. But it does definitely have a flip side in terms of the sort of life satisfaction element.
I totally resonate with that, and I don't know how much that would be amplified by being an entrepreneur, but even being like a podcast host, right? Having my own platform that's not predicated to a 9 to 5 or a salary, that's uniquely my own, and its outcomes are solely attributed to the success and the hard work that I put into a platform like this. My mental RAM, if my brain was a processor, my mental RAM is always full of podcast work. Even when I'm not on the laptop writing questions or researching for you, Joe, or recording with you or editing, I'm still thinking about the podcast. Or where could I take it next? How could it look in 5 years? Or criticizing a previous episode. I can imagine if you're an entrepreneur or a tech entrepreneur, and especially a socially conscious one, your brain probably is always consumed by zero gravity, because ultimately I don't know how I could not how I could sleep, but I think I would find so much of pressure knowing that the progression of so many young people's lives depend on me and my platform. How do you kind of manage that inner conflict or that inner monologue, if you have it?
Of social mobility in a way, which I'm completely comfortable talking about, because I think people should be authentic about the positives and negatives of everything. But the sort of dark side of social mobility is not only do you have to battle with questions of your identity in terms of stepping into new environments that are alien, whilst also stepping out of your old environment, but also like your mindset gets set in a certain way. If you're someone who's constantly trying to defy the odds, like you do get put on the sort of treadmill of life, and then once you achieve one thing, you're constantly on to the next, and you can never quite stop because you're somebody who started off almost from zero. And once you get a taste for being able to do new things and get to places that people like you shouldn't be part of, like you constantly want more, and that is great in terms of it provides the kind of driving force behind a lot of people and what they do. But then the flip side of it is it makes it very difficult to stop and take satisfaction out of what you're doing. And now I've certainly found that, but at the same time, like I wouldn't change it. Like that is, I've just accepted like that is the choice that I've made, and that is who I am. But there's definitely moments where I do sort of have pangs of not regret, but just almost like jealousy in terms of I wish I could do a bit more of that. Like I wish I could go and see Hull City more often at the weekend, and I wish I could just sort of sit down for an hour and a half and sort of enjoy a film without sort of constantly sort of checking my phone and being worried about missing a work call. And again, like I don't want to sort of cry crocodile tears and make it sound like those are the biggest issues in the world, but it is a sacrifice you have to make, and that is the dark side of social mobility, which is completely fine as long as you walk into it with your eyes open.
100%. It can either be paralyzing or empowering, because we have seen what the lack of material resources can do to the outcomes of one's life, or we know that if your organization was not to be efficacious and to collapse, and you may not be eating, or your son and daughter in the future, if you have them, will have a different quality of life because of that decision, or because of your reciprocal your own involvement, or your own decision making, or your own motivation, or your own discipline. Because especially right now, because you're back at your family home. I still live in my family home. I look after my dad. The prominent effects of poor social mobility are still so apparent for me. I get to see them as a byproduct of my everyday. So having that dark side of social mobility, in fact, is such a lever for me, because I'm 1 degree away of being reminded of what could happen if I don't lean in a bit further, if I don't accelerate. But the thing is, for me, I don't know about you, but for me, there's no limit to that. There's not like a North Star where if I get to X amount, everything's safe. I think for me, I just will have to keep on running and running and running until I find that. And I don't know if you have a predetermined target or outcome that you're striving for when you know what you have done is self-satisfactory to you. Do you have a milestone that you think, I can take the foot off the gas when I get to X, or when I get to Y, or when I achieve A, B, or C?
Not really, in all honesty. Like I'm just constantly trying to scale and improve what I've started, and there's certain sort of milestones in terms of like amount of the members I want to hit on the platform, and the amount of people we get into universities and careers, and then also taking it international to more countries. But ultimately, those are all just steps on the journey. And in terms of what I see as the ultimate milestone, I don't really know what that looks like, in all honesty. But I'm not sure I want to know, because so sometimes if you know where you're going, you start questioning actually the value of what you're doing. Whilst if you don't quite know where it's all going to lead, then you just sort of run head first into the abyss. So yeah, I don't know where it's going, in all honesty.
I either read or heard a quote on TikTok, and I can't believe I'm reciting this on a podcast, but I heard it the other day, and it actually stuck with me and resonated quite heavily. It was something along the lines of, the man that will walk further is the man that loves walking, not the man that loves the idea of the destination. And I was like, that's probably the first profound piece of wisdom I've got off of this app. And I had to note it down, because I feel like that describes my own podcast journey. And now hearing the journey that you're on, it sounds like it describes that too.
Yeah, and I think that's the sort of paradox of progress, in terms of you have to set goals to be able to get anywhere, and goals are incredibly important in terms of they've been really clear about I want to achieve X by X date, and having a way to measure your progress. And it's very difficult to achieve things if you don't create goals and hold yourself accountable to them. But at the same time, like if you put a goal on such a high pedestal, that can be quite destructive for exactly the reasons that you said, which is ultimately, if you want to do anything in life, like you have to genuinely enjoy it and be passionate about it, and sort of enjoy the ambiguity of not quite knowing where it leads. Because if you have a goal and you put it on a pedestal and you achieve it, like that is one of the most disastrous experiences you could ever go through, right? That's how midlife crises start, when you sort of achieve a goal and you realize it wasn't quite the thing that you thought it was. So yeah, I just want to sort of, sounds a bit cliche or weird, but I just want to live an extraordinary life in terms of, I don't know quite where everything's going. I have certain mini goals and milestones over the next couple of years, but ultimately where it's going, I don't know, but I don't want to know.
Mate, you are an extraordinary person and you've already lived such an extraordinary life. One of the extraordinary achievements that I saw recently, and I was so delighted to see it, was your Forbes 30 under 30 mention. How did that make you feel?
Um, so that's one of those things that, like, when I started off as a sort of 21-year-old trying to grow a business, the idea of being on the Forbes 30 under 30 list would have been completely mind-blowing in terms of there's some of the other people who've won that award, but also just the kind of like affirmation and credibility it gives you. Like I kind of underestimated actually like how big the brand of 30 under 30 is in terms of, like, even my sort of mates who I grew up with who sort of aren't involved in the whole like London entrepreneurial ecosystem, like knew about the award and sort of gave it credence. So it's kind of mind blowing in that way. But at the same time, I woke up. I remember the morning of actually receiving the award, of sort of waking up, my phone's got like 100 notifications of people messaging me. I'm like, oh god, what's happened? What have I done now? And I sort of check my notifications and check my email and see it. And I remember thinking, like, this is sort of great in a way. This is something that 21-year-old Joe would have thought was the most unbelievable thing, but it didn't sort of give me any real satisfaction, in all honesty, because I kind of realized it was a fairly artificial moment in terms of, I thought, no, this is really great recognition and this is going to be really great for me in terms of helping to open doors and build a network and create credibility around I'm doing. But actually it's not meaningful in terms of actually who I am as a person. And like, it doesn't change who I am. And I don't want it to change who I am, because like everyone has to sort of have their own narrative around themselves, and then my narrative now is being an entrepreneur and founder. But you have to sort of realize the limits and extents of that, right? And yes, I might be in the Forbes 30 on the 30 list, but I'm also a stupid 25-year-old who gets drunk at the weekend sometimes and procrastinates and doesn't do things correct, and that's not part of my narrative, but that is also part of who I am. So yeah, I think labels can be quite useful, but also can be quite destructive in a way in terms of your own narrative.
I love how you humanize yourself by talking about, like, yeah, you're 25-year-old, you procrastinate, yes, you go out at the weekend. Like, to some degree, do you think, because when I look on social media, all I see is the very polished, highlighted, perfect versions of entrepreneurs that are waking up at 5 a.m. and meditating, jumping in the sea, doing cold water therapy, working out, and eating chia seeds before they log on for the day. But in fact, that's not a realistic depiction of what an entrepreneur can look like. You mentioned that you go out at the weekend, you sometimes get drunk, you're 25. Like, how how have you managed still being a mid-20 something year old despite being the creator and founder and entrepreneur behind such a huge, prolific, socially conscious platform? Like, have you completely sacrificed your 20s for this, or are you still living the kind of life of a mid-20 something year old if you didn't start this?
I'm trying to live the life of a mid-20s person, and sometimes I struggle to do that. But but yeah, I think when people see very curated versions of entrepreneurs online, like I think that's incredibly um, it's off-putting in a way, because who are these people who get up and meditate at 6 o'clock in the morning and go to the gym every single day? I'm sure they exist, and I know some people do some of those things, but people who live that perfect existence every day, I think just are promoting an ideal of perfection which nobody could possibly reach. And I think about, like, my weekly schedule, and sure, I'm somebody who, I work hard, I get stuff done, but there's also plenty of days where I'm tired and I hit the alarm for 30 45 minutes and get an extra 45 minutes in bed when I probably shouldn't do. I should be getting to the grind straight away. And there's evenings where I'm tired and I should go to the gym, but I decide actually no, I'm gonna get a delivery instead, or gonna go out with my mates. Like, everyone's prone to the natural human impulses around doing things. And again, it'd be nice to see a kind of day in the life video or day in the week video that kind of shows that kind of stuff, because I think it's deeply human, and it's more appealing to people than seeing the perfect individual who gets up at 6, meditates, goes to the gym, has a bowl of granola. Because even though there are clearly some people who do that, 99% of people don't do that and can't relate to it. And you don't need to do that to be successful or to grow something. Like, there's wisdom in it, like the power of meditation, sure, the power of exercise, sure, and I buy into both those things. But it shouldn't be pushed as an ideal that you have to do in order to be an entrepreneur or founder.
I want to ask a question around a point we mentioned earlier about social mobility guilt. Now that you're back in Yorkshire and have been on the journey that you've been on for many of years, how well do you feel that you reintegrate back with your old mates in your old town? Do you feel a bit of a dissonance between you and them? And how do you manage any sort of guilt that might come with that?
Well, I definitely subconsciously try and adjust to it in terms of a massive code switcher. In terms of my accent, that comes out far more when I'm back up north, surrounded by Northerners. And one of the things I kind of really appreciate actually about like towns like Morley is, like, when I meet up with my mates from back home, like, the conversation isn't about work. The conversation is about football and music and stuff that we've seen online, and no one's sort of talking too in depth around about work and careers, because for a lot of people in the small towns, like, career development really isn't that interesting a topic, and people don't see that as the pinnacle in life. Whilst if you're in a huge urban hub like London, like, career development is almost all people think about and all they want to talk about. Like, I kind of joke with my friends from university that you go to an event in London, whether it's a house party or a dinner party, or you meet someone at a bar, and the first question people always ask you is, "No, what do you do?" And that's just not a question that people really ask in a lot of the rest of the UK. Like, if you meet someone in a pub in Morley, like, there's a good chance they never ask you at any point in the conversation what you do for work, because it's just not the way that people kind of relate to other individuals. And again, there's positive and negatives to that, and I enjoy coming back to that certain times and sort of being able to relax and, like, not have to play into that whole identity and narrative around being an entrepreneur. But at the same time, it's also probably one of the reasons why there are some of those cultural things that hold people back, in terms of if people sort of spoke a bit more about career development and work, maybe it would inspire people to do different kinds of stuff. So there's a flip side to everything, but I do like coming back.
I want to ask one quick question around some of the investments that I've seen you made. You're an investor in Heights, the kind of nootropic pill, right?
Yeah, so I've done some sort of micro investments in other startups, and the reason for that in many ways was to kind of keep my own brain sharp, in terms of I'm constantly caught up in, like, what I'm doing as a founder, but actually being able to look at other companies and sort of put my investor hat on is useful in terms of my own stuff that I'm doing, in terms of it helps me to think more like the sort of person who would invest in my company potentially, and sort of analyze my business model and way of working from the outside. So yeah, no, I've made some like very small investments in other startups, and it's great to sort of see the journey of other companies, and see how founders operate. And the main thing I've seen is that you can grow a company in many different ways. Like I've always been a massive advocate for the working in the office, and I think the office has loads of benefits in terms of creating a culture of belonging and creativity. But Heights, for instance, that you mentioned, is a completely remote company, and always has been, and has built an incredible culture around being remote. And that's a very different way of running a company to the way that I run Zero Gravity. But it's interesting to see two completely different ways of doing things, both yield results.
I love it, mate. The last question that I was formerly going to ask you, which I'm not going to ask you now because I already know the answer, would be what's next for Joe, but you don't seem to want to know the answer to that. I mean, you probably know what's immediately next for Joe, but in terms of long term, you don't have an answer for that. So if I were to flip the question and ask something a bit different and more of a takeaway for the listeners, or an action point for them to work on, in terms of the intersection between personal responsibility, social mobility, and self development, is there any kind of universal pieces of advice that you would give someone who was once like Joe Seddon, in a town like a place like Morley? Is there any sort of universal truths or advice that you would give him to give him a hand up and not a hand out?
Um, there's so many things I wish I could tell my younger self that would have made my journey so much easier. I think in terms of a couple of the really key ones, I had to sort of battle with perfectionism for a lot of my journey, because everyone sort of says it right, but I've always been a perfectionist, and I had a vision in my mind. I wanted to create reality that reflected that. But ultimately, like, if you're starting off from a socially mobile background and you've got no resources, it's very difficult to create something that's perfect, and you have to just learn over time to be the kind of arch pragmatist, and just find ways to get to the next point, even if it's the unconventional route. Because if you're constantly trying to create the sort of perfect ideal, you're just never going to get there if you don't have any resources. And that is the blunt reality of the journeys of a lot of socially mobile people. You have to be super pragmatic. So that is one thing I wish I could tell my younger self. And then, I mean, the other one which is connected to that is just about being relentless. There was often times when I was like, growing Zero Gravity, where I was doing loads of stuff, and I thought, no, this is going to transform the business, and it just didn't come off in terms of stuff that I thought was going to work. Just didn't have the immediate results that I thought it was gonna have. And then out of nowhere, something that I thought was never going to lead to anything turns into something massive. And I think that just shows that you can never predict sometimes when the next great leap forward is going to be, and you just got to put yourself into a position where you're actually on the pitch, and that means just being relentless. So again, I think that's super important, because I think you're conditioned by the education system to sort of have a really clear cause and effect relationship, which is, no, I do this and this is going to happen. But actually, the way the world works when you get out of education is the relationship between cause and effect is only really apparent after the fact. Like, I can look back now as a 25-year-old and tell you the things that enabled me to get to this point and point out the 3 or 4 factors. But when I was doing it, it didn't seem like that at all. You just got to be on the pitch and just be relentless, because the leap forwards do not come when you expect or where you expect. But if you keep going, they will come.
Joe, this has been an amazing podcast. I really appreciate your time. Like I said at the beginning, you're someone that I've hugely admired, and I've been so grateful and lucky to have had touch points with you already. I'm so glad that we could make this happen, and especially leave it on such a pragmatic note as well. Always trying to be informative and give takeaways on the podcast. So I'm glad that we could end the podcast by doing that. And thank you for being so vulnerable and thank you for sharing your story. I'm just so delighted we're connected. So if anyone wants to connect with you or the Zero Gravity platform, either to become a mentor or mentee, where's the best place that people can find you?
Just ping me a LinkedIn. Always answer messages on LinkedIn. Doesn't need to be an essay. Just something super short will do. And actually, that reminds me of another piece of advice I'll give very, very quickly, which is just be audacious. Message people on LinkedIn who you would never think would message you back or get in contact with you, because especially if you're somebody who's from a socially mobile background and you've got a great story of defying the odds, people will be interested in helping you. So like if you've listened to this episode and you think what I've done is interesting or relates to what you're doing in some way, please do message me. But also think of 4 or 5 people much further on their journeys than me who you can also message, because you'll be surprised about who responds to you.
100%. And thank you for offering such kindness. And I can reiterate that because this whole podcast, I didn't have a single network. I had one person as a lined up guest before I started this podcast, and it's just had a compound interest, snowball avalanche effect. Use this podcast and use Joe's story as proof of concept of that. And Joe, thank you for sharing that. And I really hope that at least one person reaches out and shares their thank you to you, or reaches out to 4 or 5 other people to. Thank you for this privilege, Joe. What an episode.
Great, good stuff, David. Thanks for having me.